I think the one I enjoyed reading more than anything else was Harry Potter.
Beneath the towering spires of Britain's most guarded palaces, where golden chandeliers reflected centuries of history, treasures slept in silence. Each gem, each ornate crown, each meticulously crafted scepter was more than ornamentation. They were echoes of a legacy, whispers of monarchs long gone and symbols of unbroken authority. The halls, polished and perfect, carried a weight that only time and tradition could grant. Servants moved with practiced reverence, their footsteps softened against the crimson carpets, their eyes always aware, though their expressions were carefully neutral. It began almost imperceptibly, a faint tremor beneath the grand surface. A whisper here, a knowing glance there, but nothing tangible, nothing confirmed. Yet within the gilded walls, where protocol and loyalty ruled with iron, precision, the murmurs grew, spreading like smoke through the hidden corridors of power. Priceless jewels, irreplaceable heirlooms that had adorned queens and princesses, seen coronations, state visits, and private celebrations, were being noticed for their absence. At first, explanations seemed reasonable. Items were on long-term loan, sent to museums, or temporarily removed for restoration. The palace vaults held thousands of objects, and some pieces naturally went missing from sight, only to reappear weeks later. Yet, the absence of certain items could not be dismissed with such casual reasoning. A sapphire brooch worn by Queen Victoria during her coronation anniversary. A pearl choker gifted to Princess Diana by a visiting dignitary from the Middle East. Even a diamond-encrusted snuff box, a relic from the Georgian era, had seemingly vanished without trace. These pieces were catalogued meticulously each year, their movements carefully logged. Yet now their presence was marked only by vague notations, cryptic entries that hinted at irregularity. Inside the palace, tension began to hum beneath the surface. Portraits of past monarchs observed in silent judgment, their painted eyes witnessing the unraveling of a trust that had been assumed unshakable. Staff who had spent lifetimes in service exchanged cautious looks, their conversations truncated and careful. Loyalty, once the unbreakable foundation of the royal household, now seemed fragile. The notion that someone from within could manipulate the system, move the treasures without scrutiny, was almost unthinkable. And yet, the signs were there, persistent and undeniable. It was at a private charity gala, held in one of London's glittering ballrooms, that the first subtle confirmation of outside suspicion came. A well-connected art dealer from Geneva, speaking lightly over champagne, mentioned an auction in Monaco where a tiara, remarkably similar to one long thought to be in the Queen Mother's private collection, had changed hands. He laughed it off as a clever imitation, but those who overheard it felt a chill. The palace's silence, once a shield, now felt like a cage, and within it, the first seeds of doubt had taken root. Prince William, who had until then trusted in the loyalty of those around him, began to notice the irregularities himself. He could sense that something was amiss, though the full picture had not yet emerged. The whisper of betrayal, like a draft under a closed door, had made its way to his awareness. He knew, deep in his heart, that the survival of the monarchy depended not just on appearances, but on uncovering the truth. In the heart of the palace, amid gold and velvet, the first moves toward revelation were about to be made. As spring deepened over London, the whispers within the palace walls began to coalesce into something more tangible yet still unspoken. During routine inventories of the royal collection, aides exchanged subtle glances, their polite smiles masking unease. At first, the anomalies seemed minor. An item misplaced here, a brooch noted as temporarily removed there, but a pattern began to emerge, one that could no longer be easily dismissed. The sapphire brooch that had adorned Queen Victoria during her coronation anniversary was unaccounted for. It had been meticulously logged the previous year, catalogued with exacting precision. Now, its record was vague, almost dismissive, a cryptic entry that offered no clarity. Next, a pearl choker, famously gifted to Princess Diana by a Middle Eastern dignitary, had vanished from its display case. Even the diamond-encrusted snuff box, a relic dating back to the Georgian era, was nowhere to be found. Each piece carried a history intertwined with the monarchy, yet their absence seemed to elude explanation. At first, the staff accepted the senior curator's reassurances. Perhaps the items were on long-term loans, or perhaps they had been moved for restoration or cleaning. The palace's vaults contained thousands of objects, and temporary relocations were common. A diamond tiara might be sent to a museum for exhibition. A necklace could be cleaned or assessed by an appraiser. These were ordinary procedures, part of the careful stewardship of priceless artifacts. Yet as weeks stretched into months, the justifications began to strain credibility. More than one storied piece could not be accounted for, and the whispered anxieties grew louder behind the closed doors of the grand salons. Staff members who had devoted decades to service lowered their voices when discussing certain names or items. The very air seemed thick with the unspoken understanding that something extraordinary and troubling was occurring. A well-connected art dealer's offhand comment at a gala had lingered in their minds. The mention of a Monaco auction where a rare tiara had changed hands, described as a perfect replica, could not be easily dismissed. To those who had glimpsed the tiara's original splendor in portraits and ceremonial photographs, the idea that it might have been sold in secrecy was chilling. Such a transaction, even if legal, implied access and authority beyond what any ordinary staff member could wield. Within Kensington Palace, aides quietly began cross-referencing old photographs with the current holdings. The deeper they looked, the more anomalies appeared. Jewelry that should have appeared at state banquets had not been seen in public for years. Pieces logged as recently moved for maintenance could not be traced to any known location. Official explanations grew thinner, more fragile, unable to account for the discrepancies. It was in these moments of quiet scrutiny that the palace's delicate ecosystem of trust began to fracture. Generations of tradition, centuries of protocol, relied upon an implicit understanding that those entrusted with the jewels would act with unquestioned loyalty. To suspect otherwise was not merely uncomfortable, it was almost unimaginable. Yet the evidence, subtle but persistent, suggested that the extraordinary was in motion. The staff became masters of discretion, careful not to allow anxiety to show. Hushed conversations in the servant corridors, subtle pauses at formal receptions, and furtive glances across drawing rooms became their language. The tension was palpable. It hovered like a shadow, silent but omnipresent. Those responsible for the vaults and inventories found themselves questioning every signature, every authorization, every temporary removal. And always, the lingering thought remained. Someone within the palace walls, someone trusted beyond doubt, might be manipulating the system. Rumors, as they often do, took on a life of their own. Servants spoke of missing items not as fact, but as possibility. Courtiers exchanged knowing looks, speaking in half-formed sentences, hinting at concerns that could not yet be voiced aloud. The palace, for all its grandeur, relied on this fragile balance, on the intersection of loyalty, discretion, and protocol. And now, that balance seemed perilously tilted. As the weeks passed, what had begun as quiet murmurs became a pervasive sense of unease. It was no longer just about missing items. It was about trust, authority, and the possibility that the very heart of the monarchy was vulnerable to internal manipulation. Somewhere within the gilded walls, someone held the power to alter history without detection, and the palace's staff could only watch in apprehensive silence, waiting for the truth to emerge. The growing unease within Kensington Palace had reached a point where quiet speculation could no longer suffice. Prince William, heir to the crown and custodian of centuries of tradition, sensed the gravity of what was unfolding. This was no ordinary discrepancy, no simple administrative error. Priceless artifacts, symbols of history, lineage, and national pride, had disappeared under circumstances too coordinated to be accidental. The whispers had reached him, faint at first, then insistent, gnawing at the edges of certainty. He knew that raising an accusation without evidence could ignite a scandal that would shake the monarchy to its foundations. Discretion was paramount, yet inaction was equally dangerous. If these treasures were truly being siphoned from the royal vaults, the consequences were unimaginable, not only in terms of monetary value, but in the betrayal of trust, the erosion of centuries-old protocols, and the potential stain on the crown itself. It was in this delicate moment that he made a decisive choice. Prince William turned to Simon Harcourt, a man whose reputation for discretion and effectiveness was unmatched. Once a respected intelligence officer, Harcourt had transitioned into private security consulting, quietly managing sensitive matters for high-profile clients, including the royals, without ever leaving a trace in the press. He was known not just for his skill, but for his understanding of the subtle interplay of loyalty, power, and secrecy. Their meeting was arranged in one of Kensington Palace's lesser-known drawing rooms, a space rarely used for public engagement. Heavy curtains muted the late afternoon light, casting the room in a subdued golden glow. Prince William did not speak as the future king, did not cloak his words in formality. Instead, he spoke as a man who understood the stakes, determined to protect his family and the legacy entrusted to him. Harcourt listened silently, absorbing each detail as William outlined the troubling situation. References to private auctions in Geneva, disappearing heirlooms, and shadowy intermediaries were met with measured nods and a slight narrowing of his eyes. When William slid a small leather-bound notebook across the table containing detailed records of missing pieces, their provenance, and prior locations, Harcourt examined it carefully. Each item was catalogued meticulously, its history recorded with precision. The pattern was subtle but discernible, and even at a glance, a trained mind could sense the underlying orchestration. The first step, Harcourt noted, would be to verify the palace's records against the documented activity of reputable auction houses, both public and private. This would require patience, precision, and a careful approach. Any misstep could alert those responsible or compromise the investigation. Weeks of meticulous research, cross-referencing photographs, sale records, and archival documents would be necessary to trace the trail, yet Harcourt approached it with quiet confidence. He knew that even the faintest trace could reveal the true path of the missing treasures. William, for his part, understood the delicate balance required. The investigation could not be overt. The palace could not afford the slightest hint of scandal. Every step had to be discreet, every inquiry invisible to the casual observer. Trust in the household was still essential. Those loyal to the crown needed to remain unaware of suspicion while the truth was uncovered. The task was delicate, almost surgical, and yet unavoidable. As the meeting concluded, there was a tacit understanding between the two men. The investigation would proceed quietly, methodically, and without fanfare. The palace, with all its history, opulence, and secrets, had become a stage for a hidden pursuit. Somewhere within its walls, someone wielded authority that allowed them to manipulate appearances, and it was now up to Harcourt and William to follow the faint trail of evidence toward a revelation that would alter the course of the monarchy's story. In that quiet room, with shadows stretching across the polished floor, the first real moves toward uncovering the truth were made. The whispers of missing jewels were no longer mere conjecture. They had become a challenge, a puzzle, and a warning. Someone had breached the sanctity of the crown's treasures, and the pursuit of that truth would take them deep into the heart of power itself. Once the decision was made, Simon Hardcourt wasted no time. His unmarked office in central London became the nerve center for a painstaking investigation. Stacks of archival photographs, auction records, and private correspondence cluttered the room. Every piece of data, every faint trace of a jewel's movement was scrutinized with relentless precision. For someone unfamiliar with the world of high-value collectibles, the information might have seemed impenetrable. Disconnected transactions, vague item descriptions, and intermediaries cloaked in anonymity. But to Hardcourt, patterns were hidden, in the smallest details, waiting to be uncovered. The first breakthrough came from a Parisian auction house. Among the nondescript catalog of gemstones and fine jewelry, a diamond necklace caught Hardcourt's eye. Its design, the arrangement of its stones, and the custom clasp were all unmistakably reminiscent of a piece worn by Queen Elizabeth during a state visit in the early 1970s. The auction record obscured the seller behind a corporate front, yet the transaction had been facilitated by a luxury broker known to serve multiple European royal households. The details were fragmentary, but sufficient to raise a serious question. How had a crown jewel found its way into private hands without trace? From that point, the investigation gained momentum. Hardcourt expanded his search across Geneva, Antwerp, and Dubai, cities notorious for high-value gems changing hands under discreet circumstances. Each lead was followed meticulously, every record cross-referenced with photographs, appraisals, and shipment logs. Slowly, a disturbing pattern emerged. Several pieces, all tied to the royal collection, had surfaced in private auctions over the past 18 months. A sapphire ring listed only as European royal origin. A mid-19th century brooch described as exceptional quality. A gold bracelet, its flowing script eerily similar to that of King George VI. Each sale was carefully traced to different auction houses, yet the fingerprints were strikingly consistent. Legal representatives appeared, repeatedly suggesting a network of intermediaries coordinating the transactions. The couriers, luxury transporters, and offshore accounts all pointed to a single guiding hand. This was no random act, no opportunistic theft. The movement of the jewels was deliberate, methodical, and executed with knowledge of both the item's value and the means to obscure their provenance. Hardcourt began preparing a dossier for Prince William, carefully noting not only the confirmed findings but also the gaps that remained, the pieces of the puzzle yet to be aligned. Weeks turned into months as the investigation progressed. Each discovery required validation, verifying the authenticity of the jewels, ensuring photographs matched archival records, and confirming the chain of custody. It was slow, methodical work, hinging on the smallest details, a distinctive cut of a gemstone, an engraving on a clasp, a subtle mark of restoration. Every element mattered. One evening, after hours of cross-referencing, Hardcourt pinpointed a second jewel, a sapphire ring in Geneva, its description deliberately vague but unmistakable to a trained eye. A gold bracelet, once thought securely stored in the palace vaults, surfaced through an auction in Dubai, its path masked by shell companies and anonymous transactions. The investigation began to reveal the operation's sophistication. Whoever orchestrated the removal of these jewels understood both the palace's security systems and the processes by which high-value items could be sold without drawing attention. Temporary removals, which required signed authorizations, could be executed seamlessly by someone with the right authority. Paperwork could be forged or signed under guise, allowing the items to leave without raising suspicion. The realization was chilling. The breach was not an oversight, but a calculated exploitation of trust. Hardcourt expanded his network of discreet contacts. Former appraisers, luxury brokers, and retired couriers were approached under strict confidentiality. Some were hesitant, others cautious, but persistence yielded results. In Antwerp, A retired gem appraiser finally admitted over coffee that he had evaluated several items resembling royal jewels for a private client years earlier. Paid in cash and sworn to secrecy, he could not name the ultimate recipient, but his recollection added depth and texture to the emerging trail. The intermediary he dealt with spoke with a refined English accent but consistently took calls in French, a detail that Hardcourt filed meticulously for future cross-referencing. Now the investigation had shifted from suspicion to pursuit. No longer were the jewels merely missing. They were actively being traced. Each piece unearthed a thread that led to another, weaving a network of transactions and intermediaries that spanned Europe and the Middle East. The palace records, previously considered authoritative, revealed discrepancies and oversights, yet their gaps now became crucial clues. Hardcourt's expertise allowed him to reconstruct the movement of the treasures with increasing precision. The pattern was undeniable. This was an orchestrated, systematic relocation of the royal jewels. The individuals behind it understood the mechanics of palace operations, the vulnerabilities in oversight, and the ways to disguise transactions across borders. The trail grew warmer with each day, and the reality became unavoidable. Someone within the royal household, someone trusted with authority, was orchestrating the movement of these priceless artifacts. When Hardcourt presented the growing dossier to Prince William, the weight of it filled the room. Photographs of the jewels, archival records, auction slips, and correspondence lay before them. Every piece represented not just monetary value, but history, moments frozen in time, coronations, state visits, intimate family celebrations. To see them displaced, hidden, or sold was an act not merely of theft, but of erasure. The investigation had revealed its first undeniable truth. The missing jewels were not lost by accident. They were being moved with intention by someone who knew the palace inside out. By now, the investigation had moved from distant traces to shadows cast within the palace itself. Hardcourt had traced multiple transactions to intermediaries and auction houses, and a pattern was emerging. One that pointed unmistakably toward someone with authority inside the royal household. The implications were staggering. The perpetrator was not an outsider, but a trusted insider, someone whose loyalty had never been questioned. Confidential sources began to reveal fragments of the truth. Retired gem appraisers, luxury brokers, and couriers reluctantly recounted details of transactions that, on the surface, seemed legitimate. A retired Antwerp appraiser remembered vividly the jewels brought to him for evaluation. The intermediary, he recalled, spoke with a refined English accent, but always answered calls in French, adding a layer of distance and obfuscation. The pieces, though superficially evaluated and handled discreetly, were unmistakably royal. The appraiser could not name the client, but his testimony confirmed that the jewels had left the palace through carefully orchestrated channels. Each new lead raised the stakes. The closer Hardcourt got to the truth, the more precarious his position became. The palace, a world built on hierarchy and discretion, was not accustomed to being scrutinized from within. Any hint of investigation could alarm the wrong person and compromise the delicate balance of trust. Yet the jewels' absence demanded answers, and every day without progress risked further loss and greater scandal. The tension was palpable in every corner of Kensington Palace. Servants moved with exaggerated care, their eyes darting, their movements deliberate but tense. Courtiers whispered cautiously, careful not to be overheard. Portraits of past monarchs seemed to watch over corridors, silent witnesses to a quiet unraveling of security and trust. In such a tightly controlled environment, even the smallest irregularity became magnified, every unexplained authorization or temporary removal carrying enormous weight. Hardcourt's persistence began to pay off. Through subtle interrogation and careful verification, he mapped a network of individuals who had handled the jewels, tracing their movements across multiple borders. Every courier, appraiser, and broker held fragments of the puzzle. When cross-referenced, with palace authorizations and internal movements, a clearer picture of orchestration emerged. This was no random act. The jewels were moved deliberately, with meticulous planning and precise execution. Yet the most chilling realization was that the mastermind had the authority to bypass standard security measures. The paperwork required for temporary removals, cleaning, valuation, exhibition, could be signed at the highest level, allowing the jewels to leave unnoticed. Harcourt and William both understood the horrifying possibility. Whoever was behind this had the power to act openly, under the guise of legitimacy, without arousing suspicion. The breach of trust ran deep, and the closer they approached the truth, the more dangerous it became. The investigation took them to dimly lit cafes in Antwerp and private offices in Geneva, where reluctant witnesses revealed the scope of the operation. Luxury brokers had facilitated discreet sales, corporate fronts obscured ownership, and offshore accounts managed the proceeds. Each discovery added layers of complexity and danger, drawing Harcourt ever closer to confronting the individual at the heart of the scheme. Inside the palace, the tension mounted in ways both subtle and profound. Staff noticed changes in protocol, the quiet scrutiny of authorized movements, and the occasional shadow of unease in those who had previously carried out their duties with unquestioned certainty. Whispers persisted. Corridors seemed quieter, yet charged, and the weight of suspicion pressed heavily against the gilded walls. It was in these moments, amid the labyrinth of secrecy and protocol, that the investigation reached its most precarious point. Harcourt had traced the trail closer than ever to the palace itself, drawing nearer to a revelation no one had dared imagine. Every step now carried risk. Every uncovered detail was a step toward confrontation. The jewels, once mere objects of beauty and heritage, had become symbols of trust betrayed and authority challenged. The stage was set for a confrontation with history itself, a moment where loyalty, deception, and power would collide. In the hushed corridors of Kensington Palace, the heart of the investigation beat louder than any footstep, signaling that the truth was no longer distant. It was imminent. The culmination of months of painstaking investigation brought Harcourt and Prince William to a truth as shocking as it was inevitable. The trail, meticulously traced from Paris to Geneva, from Dubai to Antwerp, pointed not to a random thief or a rogue intermediary, but to someone within the palace itself, someone whose authority had allowed the jewels to move unnoticed, whose loyalty had never been questioned, someone at the very heart of the monarchy. As Harcourt laid out the final pieces of evidence in the quiet of a drawing room, the room seemed to shrink around them. Photographs of the missing jewels, cross-referenced auction records, and detailed accounts of intermediaries formed an undeniable chain. Each transaction, each carefully orchestrated removal, all converged toward a single, unsettling conclusion. Queen Camilla had orchestrated the movement of the royal treasures. Her authority within the palace, her intimate knowledge of protocols, and her unquestioned access made her capable of moving priceless artifacts without raising suspicion. The implications were monumental. These were not mere ornaments lost to time. They were symbols of history, of continuity, of the monarchy itself. To see them relocated, hidden, or sold was not just theft. It was a violation of trust, a breach of legacy, and a challenge to the crown's very authority. Prince William sat in stunned silence, absorbing the weight of the revelation. Every jewel represented a chapter of history, coronations, state visits, family milestones, and each had been manipulated under the guise of legitimacy. Harcourt explained the method with surgical precision. Temporary removals for cleaning or exhibition were authorized at the highest level, and when signed by someone with supreme authority, no one questioned the transactions. This was how the jewels had vanished without triggering alarms. The realization was chilling. The breach was not only deliberate but expertly concealed. The mastermind had leveraged position, trust, and protocol, turning the palace itself into an unwitting accomplice. The room was thick with tension as they considered the consequences. Public exposure of the scandal could irreparably damage the monarchy, eroding centuries of public trust and tradition. Yet inaction was equally perilous. The jewels and the legacy they represented could not remain in private hands, scattered across the continent through secret auctions and intermediaries. The future king faced a decision that went beyond punishment. It was a question of safeguarding history, of preserving the sanctity of the crown, and of reasserting control over what had been taken. Every detail of the operation had been meticulously planned. Corporate fronts obscured ownership, luxury couriers transported the treasures discreetly, and offshore accounts managed the profits. The jewels were not stolen in haste. They were relocated with precision, each movement calculated to avoid detection, each transaction orchestrated to maintain an appearance of legitimacy. The revelation was a testament not only to the mastermind's audacity, but to their understanding of power, discretion, and influence within the palace walls. As William and Harcourt absorbed the full scale of the operation, the weight of responsibility pressed heavily upon them. The jewels were not mere objects. They were the embodiment of centuries of history, each one a tangible link to the past. Their loss was symbolic, a threat to the continuity of the monarchy itself. Yet there was also a grim clarity. The mastermind had acted with intention, fully aware of the consequences, and their actions could no longer be ignored or quietly rectified. In that quiet room, with shadows stretching across the polished floors, and the golden afternoon light dimmed by heavy curtains, the truth stood bare and undeniable. The whispers of missing jewels, the hints and rumors that had begun as faint murmurs months ago, had led to a revelation that shook the very foundations of the palace. Loyalty had been betrayed, history had been manipulated, and the crown faced its most delicate challenge in decades. The confrontation with the mastermind, when it came, would not merely be about reclaiming lost treasures. It would be a reckoning, a recalibration of trust, and a reaffirmation of the authority and responsibility that defined the monarchy. The jewels, symbols of tradition and power, were more than gold and gemstones. They were the legacy of a nation, and their recovery was a task of utmost importance and gravity. In the days following the revelation, the palace moved with careful precision. The missing jewels, each a fragment of history, were gradually recovered, returned to secure vaults, or replaced with indistinguishable facsimiles